Hello, everyone. My name is Sorabh Tomar, and I'm at SMU's Cox School of Business. I want to give a big thank you to the conference organizers for putting together this wonderful event and for letting me share my work with you. In the last 2 decades, we've seen climate-related disclosures go from something kind of hanging around in the background to something that's front of mind, with items like the SEC's climate-related disclosures and the EU's CSRD frequently making the financial news headlines. Now, if you look at these different rules, like a key item that's typically always disclosed is a business's greenhouse gas levels. In my research, I wanted to study whether requiring businesses to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions would actually lead to emissions reductions. Now, a lot of the rules under discussion, they haven't kicked in yet, and so they're not super helpful for helping us answer this question now. But it turns out that in the US, there's actually been an economy-wide greenhouse gas reporting program in operation since 2010, and that's been administered by the US's Environmental Protection Agency. And so that's the disclosure I'm going to be studying. It's the greenhouse gas reporting program run by the EPA, and it requires facilities emitting over 25,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions in carbon dioxide equivalent to report those emissions to the EPA. And these reports, they're eventually made public. I'll call this the GHGRP, and it was meant to be a precursor to cap and trade in the US. But cap and trade eventually hit some roadblocks, but the GHGRP survived. All the information is available on the EPA's website. The data do not need to be audited by a third party, but there are penalties for reporting violations, not to mention the public shame that would come if a business was falsifying its reports. Now, a notable feature of the GHGRP data is that it provides granular operational level information. And this is in contrast to some of the reporting programs I discussed earlier. What do I mean by operational information? Well, let's take a look. So here's an excerpt from Continental Tires, a facility in Illinois. It's an individual factory. And as you can see, it emitted about 72,500 tons of CO2 equivalent during 2022. But if you keep scrolling, you actually get even more information. If you go further, you can see that it had a space heater that uses natural gas. You can see the heat capacity was 6.8, and you can see that it produced about 26,000 tons of carbon dioxide, a little bit of methane, and a little bit of nitrous oxide. So this is really granular information. And so the question is, does requiring firms to disclose this information lead to emissions reductions? Well, to answer that, we need to overcome two challenges. The first is finding out, what were the emissions before they became public? Now, the GHGRP implementation timeline is actually nice for this because the first batch of data collected in 2010 was only publicly available in 2012. So there's actually three phases. Initially we have no one's measuring emissions, there's no reporting to the EPA, and there's no disclosure. And then the firms start measuring their emissions, sending that information to the EPA, but it's not publicly available yet. And then, beginning in 2012, everything's happening. Facilities are measuring their emissions, they're reporting it to the EPA, and this information is public. So, in the end, there's 2 years of data for 2010 and 11 where, as the researcher, we get to see it, but the public wasn't seeing it in real time. And the other challenge is to know what would emissions look like if there was no GHGRP. So for this, I'm going to use Canadian facilities. The idea is that Canadian facilities will face pretty similar economic and technological shocks as US facilities. So if there's a change in natural gas prices or there's an availability of new insulation technology, all those facilities, Canadian and US, will have those at their disposal. So what I'll do is I'll compare, for example, a US chemical refiner with a Canadian chemical refiner and see how the difference in emissions for these different refiners changes once the GHGRP comes online. And that should only affect the US refiners. Okay, so this is the main result. What I find is that the difference in emissions between Canadian and US facilities, it stays pretty steady in 2010 and 11 before the data are publicly available. But then once we get to 2012, we see that emissions fall by about 7.9% for the US facilities. If I estimate CO2 emissions using additional pollution data, then I actually see a similar result. emissions differences stay pretty similar, 2008 all the way up until 2011. But then in 2012, once the data become public, we see an emissions decline. So why does the GHGRP lead to this emissions reduction? Well, I want you to imagine that you run a cement factory and you know roughly how much cement your rival is producing. Once the GHGRP data become available, you can now figure out that maybe your rival is producing cement by burning 95% as much fuel as you do. Now, this would suggest that there might be a better way to make your cement, and you might now go out and look for that better way. And in fact, the GHGRP data, because it's so granular, it might give you some specific clues about how you could reduce your emissions intensity. And I call this sort of like looking at your rival's data, benchmarking. And you might benchmark purely for financial motives, or you might do it because you just don't want to be the worst of the bunch when all this information becomes public. And I provide 4 sets of evidence in the paper that I think is pretty consistent with benchmarking. First, I show that the dispersion or the spread in US facilities emissions shrinks, and that's consistent under a benchmarking story. And I then show that if you're one of the most carbon intense facilities, you have the largest subsequent emissions reductions, but this is only when the data become public and visible. And then I see, does your firm have a history or a culture of looking at its peers' information in other contexts? And if you do, I call you a benchmarker. And I find that these benchmarking firms have lower emissions reductions. And finally, I see that, again, there's a convergence in the processes that facilities and their peers use. And the direction of this convergence is towards less carbon intensity. So all of these together, provides evidence, I think, pretty reliably about benchmarking taking place. Now, I mentioned you might benchmark purely for financial reasons. You might also benchmark because you don't want to be the worst of the bunch. But, worst of the bunch in the eyes of who? Well, we're investors using this information. What about climate activists? What about the public or the media? Well, I went through all these comment letters. I spoke with some investors. I read through the newspaper articles, and I ran my own tests. And the answer was negative. But I should stress that this is back in the early 2010s. And I think global priorities were slightly different back then, if we're thinking back to, coming out of the global financial crisis. So, if it's not investors, it's not the public, activists, and so forth, what about, the regulators, the politicians? Well, we know that the greenhouse gas reporting program, it was at one point tied to potential cap and trade. So what I do is I examine whether facilities have their politicians in mind when they reduce emissions. And what I find is that actually the emissions reductions are larger for facilities that have climate change progressive senators, based on those senators' voting behavior. And I also find that when firms are more active in the political process, and I'm talking here about donating to their representatives' election campaigns, those facilities have larger emissions reductions. And, those might be the more politically vigilant facilities, or they might want to cast their representatives in a favorable light. In general, the evidence supports some sort of regulatory concern driving emissions reductions. So in the end, is it worth making facilities disclose granular data like I showed you before? Well, if you go just from the estimated preparation and admin costs, and you compare that to the emissions abated times the social cost of carbon, the answer is easily a yes. But, what if I'm disincentivized to innovate at my facility because I'm worried about how my rivals, are going to learn about my operations? I think that sort of proprietary cost is something we should also consider, and I think more work is needed in that area. And, what does my paper say about the SEC's required GHG disclosures? Well, these are going to be aggregated and at the firm level compared to the facility and unit level data that I study in the EPA's program. Now, there's some other very interesting work by my colleagues, studying firm level greenhouse gas disclosure in the UK. And the evidence there is that a firm level disclosure can also lead to emissions reductions. So I think what's going on here is that as the data get more granular, it becomes more actionable by your peers in an operational sense. And that's what I've shown in my paper. But as the data get more aggregated, I think they become more usable by investors and non-technical folk, but they probably have less operational usefulness. But I do think this idea of benchmarking generally, especially not wanting to look the worst relative to your peers, I think that can be empowered not only with granular disaggregated GHG data, but also probably with aggregated firm level GHG data. So thank you so much for tuning in.